Well, a federal judge in Georgia has backed the removal of nearly 100,000 names from the state's list of registered voters. The judge says that the state's move to cancel the voter registration status of inactive voters did not violate the U.S. Constitution. The decision comes as state officials face accusations of voter suppression. Georgia is one of 9 states with the use it or lose it law, which allows registrations to be canceled if people don't vote for several years. So joining us now for more on this from Atlanta, Georgia, is Mark Niesse. He's a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thank you very much for joining us. So this particular situation in Georgia is getting a lot of media attention. Can you just explain to our audience what the use it or lose it law means and why it's on the books?
What it means is that if you don't participate in elections in Georgia for 8 or more years, then you could be removed from the voter registration rolls, that your voter registration will be canceled and you will no longer be eligible to vote in Georgia. And Georgia is one of a handful of states that has these kinds of laws. And what they do is, in most states, every state cleans up its voter registration list to account for people who have moved away and are no longer eligible to vote in that state. Some states, like Georgia, also have these use it or lose it laws that remove people from registration lists when they haven't voted for a number of years.
So when the original list was compiled, was there an indication that certain groups found themselves disproportionately on this list? Because I know the accusation is that this is an attempt at voter suppression. So could you see that based on the list?
The answer in this case is no. There have been many examples of racial disparities in voting practices in Georgia, but this time around, in this year's round of voter registration cancellations, there was not a apparent racial disparity. The number of white voters, black voters, other races of voters very closely matched their total proportion of the total number of registered voters in Georgia.
Okay. So explain to us just how the process went. Letters were sent out to residents, right? And they had to respond by a certain time?
That's right. In November, the election officials sent out letters to everyone in the state who was on the list of people who may have been eligible to be canceled. And then those voters had 30 to 40 days to respond to election officials if they did not want to be canceled. What we know is that about 4,500 of the more than 300,000 people who were sent those notices did in fact respond and were thus not canceled. But the remaining number of voters were still able to be removed from Georgia's voter registration list.
Okay, so if the argument is, listen, we need to figure out who's even living in the state, who's alive, this is part of the reason why we're doing this, what's the counter argument? Because we know Fair Fight, which is a voter rights group co-founded by Stacey Abrams, they took the state to court. And what was their counter argument?
Their argument is that these kind of laws take away people's voting rights just because they chose not to exercise that right. Fair Fight Action, the group founded by allies of Stacey Abrams, argues that just because you don't exercise your right, you shouldn't lose your right to vote. Maybe these voters chose not to participate in elections because they didn't like the candidates. Maybe they were waiting for a candidate who spoke to them. They argue that voting rights are rights and you don't lose your rights just because you don't use them.
And so if you find yourself on this list and suddenly crossed off and you show up at a polling station, then what happens?
If you're not registered to vote, you can't vote. Your vote will not be counted if you are not registered to vote. However, the next major Georgia election is the March 24th presidential primary. Anyone whose registration has been canceled can still re-register to vote and be eligible to participate in future registrations. But if you're not registered to vote, your vote won't count.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think we do have to sort of mention the context here for Georgia. And I know there are other states that have very similar laws, but particularly in Georgia, when we talk about Stacey Abrams, we talk about the race that she was in. You know, there were a lot of allegations of voter suppression and general shady business. So can you kind of like talk to us about why, in particular, voting rights, they're under scrutiny in Georgia?
Yes, Georgia is a major center throughout the nation for voting rights, in part because of Georgia's laws and practices, in part because Democrat Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor last year, made it a main component of her campaign and accompanied that with Georgia and the South's history of voting rights struggles. And it is especially relevant here. In Georgia, not only did we have voters removed from the rolls because of inactivity. And we have also had a high number of precinct closures, absentee ballot rejections, very long lines at polling places during last year's election, sometimes 3 or 4 hours, voting machine and equipment failures and replacements, missing voter registrations, all kinds of issues that have arisen surrounding elections, which has turned it into a campaign issue where candidates are trying to motivate voters to get out there and vote and be part of the process.
Can we talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Advancement Act for 2019, which is basically sort of a promise or a commitment to overhaul the system, essentially, and you could probably explain it better, to ensure that everyone's right to vote is respected. Is that a good way of defining it?
So this act that passed the U.S. House of Representatives earlier this month, it would restore parts of the Voting Rights Act that were effectively invalidated by the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2013. Before 2013, and since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the U.S. Justice Department had oversight of changes in voting practices, such as voter registration cancellations and changes in precinct locations. Since 2013, that oversight function has been severely reduced. Basically, the Supreme Court said that these states that in 1965 had discriminatory practices don't necessarily have discriminatory practices today. So what the Voting Rights Advancement Act would do would be to restore federal oversight of election practices in states with a more recent history of problems or discrimination in their elections.
And what's the status on that now? House Democrats are supportive.
Yes, and it passed the U.S. House. So now the bill will go over to the U.S. Senate, where it probably will have a very difficult path forward because the politics in the Senate are different, and opponents of this legislation, primarily Republicans, feel like it's federal overreach into state election practices. They prefer that the states manage their own elections rather than have the federal government have this oversight role.
Mark Niesse, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed.